Evening, friends. The fire's burning low tonight. Just the way I like it. Truth be told, a fire that's done most of its work for the evening, settling down into itself, orange coals, breathing gentle underneath a thin layer of ash that glows soft whenever the breeze finds it. Out here on the porch, the desert night has come in full now, and the air's got that particular coolness to it that you only find past a certain hour. Not cold enough to send you inside, but cool enough to remind you that the day is well and truly finished, that the world has put down whatever it was carrying and decided to rest a while. The sky overhead is something worth looking at on a night like this. No moon to speak of, so the stars have the whole canvas to themselves, and they've made use of it. Sharp, clear points of light all the way from one horizon to the other, the kind you can only see out here where there's no town glow to soften them. Sometimes I sit out here and I don't think about much of anything at all. I just watch the coals and listen to the quiet. And the quiet here in Cottonwood Creek has a particular texture to it, layers to it, if that makes any sense. There's the near sounds, the creak of this old porch chair, the small settling sounds the house makes as the wood cools down from the day's heat. Then there's the middle sounds, a night bird somewhere down near the creek itself, the dry rustle of the cottonwood leaves when a breath of air moves through. And then there's the far sounds, the ones you feel more than hear, the vast empty stillness of the desert and the flats beyond town, stretching out in every direction under all those stars. Been living in this town a long time now, long enough that the town and I have sort of grown into each other the way an old tree grows around a fence post that was set too close. I know every board on every building along Main Street. I know which ones creak in the morning cold and which ones have gone soft and need replacing. I know where the shadows fall on a clear night and where the lamplight from a window can reach clear across the street and make the dust on the boardwalk look almost golden. I was thinking earlier today, before the sun went down, when I was sitting out front, watching the last of the afternoon light go orange on the buildings across the way, I was thinking about a particular autumn evening, a long while back now. Must have been 1890. I was still wearing the deputy's star then, still doing my rounds, still knew every face that came through those saloon doors, and most of the stories that went along with those faces. There was a night that autumn when the saloon went still earlier than usual, not because of anything dramatic, not because of any trouble or any argument that cleared the room. It went still the way a pond goes, still when the wind simply decides to stop for a while. Gradual, natural, like the evening itself had just grown tired and suggested, quietly, that everybody might want to find their way home. I've thought about that night more times than I could count, not because anything happened that was particularly worth remembering, but maybe because of exactly the opposite, because nothing much happened at all, and yet the memory of it has stayed with me, clear and quiet, like water in a still glass. Let me take you back there, friends, if you'll let me. Back to that autumn in Cottonwood Creek, when the air was already cooling down toward winter, and the light had that particular thin quality that autumn light has, like it's being stretched a little too far, and knows it. The afternoon had been warm enough, as I recall. One of those October days that comes along every so often out here to remind you that summer hasn't entirely let go yet, though it's loosening its grip. By 3 o'clock, the sun was low enough to angle directly down Main Street, coming in flat and gold between the buildings, and it caught everything. The dust motes drifting in the air, the weather vane on the feed store turning slow, the brass hitching rings along the front of the saloon, all lit up like small lanterns. I'd finished the afternoon ledger work earlier than usual that day. Nothing particularly demanding, a few notes about a fence dispute on the south edge of town that had already settled itself amicably, a record of some supplies that had come in on the afternoon freight, a note about a small repair needed to the gatepost at the edge of the livery yard. The kind of paperwork that fills a deputy's days more thoroughly than most people imagine, if I'm being plain about it. People picture the work as something more exciting than it generally was. The truth is, most of the job was writing things down, checking that everything was as it should be, and then walking around to check again. I stepped out onto the front porch of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Wallen was away that week, had gone up to the county seat for some procedural business, and wasn't expected back until Thursday. And I stood there a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the afternoon glare. The street was quiet, but not empty. Old Clarence Tibbs was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his dry goods store with the same steady, unhurried strokes he'd been using for as long as I could remember, the broom moving back and forth like a slow pendulum. Mrs. Delacroix from the milliners was crossing the street at the far end, carrying a wrapped parcel under one arm, her skirt raising a small trail of dust as she went. 2 horses were tied at the rail outside the saloon. One a deep bay I recognized as belonging to a rancher named Hollis, who came in most Tuesdays. The other a Grula mare I didn't know offhand. The saloon itself, the Amber Post it was called, which was a name that had always struck me as suitably dignified for a drinking establishment, sat in the middle of the block on the east side of Main Street, its facade freshly whitewashed earlier that summer, and already beginning to take on the particular golden tone that all wood takes out here once the sun has worked on it long enough. 2 large windows flanked the double doors, and in the afternoons the light came through those windows at an angle that made the interior look warmer than it actually was, all amber and slow-moving, which I always thought was fitting given the name. I crossed the street and walked along the boardwalk on the saloon side of the block, not in a hurry, just doing what I did most afternoons, keeping an eye on things, nodding to people, letting myself be seen. There's a value to that, being seen. It's not about authority, not really. It's more about continuity. People feel steadier when the familiar things are in their familiar places. And if a deputy walking his regular route can be one of those familiar I tipped my hat to Mrs. Delacroix as she passed, and she gave me one of her small, precise smiles, the kind that suggests approval without enthusiasm, which was about as warm as she generally got. I nodded to Clarence Tibbs, and he nodded back without breaking the rhythm of his sweeping. I passed the saloon doors and caught a thread of sound from inside. Voices at a low register, the clink of glass, the particular wooden thud of a chair being shifted on a plank floor. Nothing demanding attention, just the ordinary music of an ordinary afternoon. I continued to the end of the block, turned, and walked the cross street back to the other side of Main, checking the alley between the hardware and the assay office as I went. A habit, nothing more. It was always empty. And then made my way back up the other side. The light was changing already by that point, the gold of it deepening, the shadows stretching longer from the bases of the buildings. The temperature was dropping, degree by slow degree. You could feel it on the back of your hands first, that first real hint of the evening chill. I went back inside, wrote a few more lines in the ledger, and then sat for a while at the window watching the street go through its evening changes. This was something I'd done so many times that it had become a kind of meditation without my ever deciding to make it one. The town had a rhythm to its evenings, as reliable as the rhythm of breathing. Around 5 o'clock, the working day ended for most people, and there was a brief increase in foot traffic. Men heading to the saloon, women and children heading home. A few horses being untied and pointed toward the outskirts. Then it quieted and stayed quiet for a half hour or so while suppers were cooked and eaten. Then, around 7 or so, a secondary rhythm would begin. The saloon picking back up, lanterns being lit along the street, the occasional wagon coming or going. That evening followed its pattern faithfully right up until the point when it didn't, which is to say right up until around 8:30 or 9 o'clock, when I noticed something slightly out of the ordinary. Not alarming, not even particularly notable on reflection, just different in a quiet way. The saloon was going still. I noticed it because of the sound, or rather, because of the changing quality of the sound. Through the open window of the office, I kept it open most evenings unless the wind was carrying dust. I've been hearing the Amber Post's usual evening noise, a comfortable background presence, voices and movement, and the occasional burst of laughter. Familiar enough that you stop registering it the way you stop registering the sound of a clock ticking in a room you know well. But somewhere around that hour, I became aware that it had faded, not all at once, but steadily, over the course of perhaps 20 minutes. The way a stream fades as it moves into softer ground and spreads out and loses its hurry. I set down my pen and listened more carefully. The street was mostly quiet at this hour on a weeknight. This was a Tuesday, I'm fairly certain, which was never the most social evening of the week. And in that quiet, I could pick out the sounds from the Amber Post with some clarity. Voices, but fewer than before. No laughter that I could identify. The clink of a glass, unhurried. And then, for a stretch of several minutes, almost nothing at all. I put on my hat and went out. The evening air had changed from what it had been even an hour earlier. The warmth of the day was well and truly gone now, replaced by a clean, dry coolness that carried a hint of sage from somewhere out on the flats. The sky above was deep and clear, the stars doing their work with no competition from a moon. And the street itself was empty, except for a single lantern burning outside the livery, and the light from the saloon windows painting yellow rectangles on the boardwalk across the way. I crossed over and stood for a moment outside the Amber Post's doors, not going in yet, just listening. Inside, the room had settled into something approaching silence. I could hear one conversation, low and unhurried, and the sound of someone moving around behind the bar. Pete Alderman, who owned and ran the place, had a particular way of moving that you learned to recognize if you spent enough time in the vicinity. A slight shuffle, a deliberate quality to his movements, like a man who decided each action before taking it. I pushed through the doors. The room was nearly empty. That was the first thing that struck me. Not in a troubling way, just as a plain fact. On a Tuesday in October, at close to 9 in the evening, this was not entirely unusual. But still, the tables that had been occupied when I'd glanced in briefly around 6 o'clock, perhaps 4 or 5 of them, now held only one man, a fellow named Guthrie, who worked out at the Heller Ranch and came in most weeks for an evening by himself, nursing a single glass of something over the course of an hour or two, never causing any difficulty. He was sitting in his usual spot near the back wall, his hat on the table beside him, staring at nothing in particular, with the comfortable vacancy of a man who has nowhere he needs to be. Pete Alderman was behind the bar, wiping down the counter with the slow, circular motions of a man with time to spare. He looked up when I came in and gave me a small nod, the kind that meant nothing urgent, just acknowledgement. "Quiet evening," I said. "Quieter than most," he agreed. His voice was the kind that didn't need to be loud to carry, a measured, settled voice, not much given to drama. He'd been running the Amber Post for the better part of 10 years, and in that time had developed the kind of equanimity about most things that comes from seeing a sufficient variety of human behavior to stop being surprised by any of it. I leaned against the bar and looked around the room. The lamps were burning lower than they usually were at this hour, not so low as to be dim, but lower, as if the room itself was aware that the evening was winding down and was making its accommodations. The 2 large windows were dark mirrors now, the night outside pressing gently against the glass. A few playing cards were scattered on one table, abandoned mid-game by someone who'd evidently decided to call it an early night. "The Hollis party left early," Pete said, not quite answering a question I hadn't asked, but anticipating it, which was a habit of his. Said the cold was coming on, and they had a long ride back. I nodded. That made sense. The ranches outside of town were always calculating ride times and weather, and October evenings could turn cold enough to make a long ride unpleasant, especially if you'd spent the evening inside and your body had forgotten what the outside temperature had become. Anyone else expected in? Pete considered this the way he considered most things, unhurried. Don't believe so. The freight boys who came through yesterday have moved on. Don't know of anyone else with a reason to be out on a Tuesday. I straightened up from the bar and walked a slow circuit around the room, just as a matter of course. This was something I'd always done in the Amber Post and in the other establishments along Main Street. Not an inspection exactly, more of a presence walk, letting the room know that order was nearby and comfortable with the room's general condition. I checked the window latches on the side wall, both secure. I walked past Guthrie's table, and he looked up briefly, nodded without any particular expression, and returned his gaze to the middle distance. I checked the door to the back storeroom, closed and properly latched. I came back to the bar. "Think I'll make my rounds and then call it a reasonable hour," I said. Pete nodded. "I'll be closing up within the half hour, I expect. Not much reason to keep the lamps burning with nobody to burn them for." That was Pete Alderman's particular philosophy, summed up in a sentence. Not frugal exactly, not inhospitable, just practical. The lamps served a purpose, and when the purpose was fulfilled, you extinguished them carefully and put the evening to rest properly. I went back out through the double doors into the night. The street was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that has settled in and decided to stay. That isn't the temporary quiet between events, but the proper quiet of an evening that has run its course. I stood on the boardwalk for a moment, hands at my sides, and let my eyes adjust back to the dark. The lantern outside the livery was a warm, steady point of light down at the end of the block. Somewhere beyond the buildings on the east side, I could hear the faint sound of the creek moving over its stones. It was a dry season, but not entirely dry, and the creek still had enough water in it to make a sound if the night was quiet enough to let you hear it. I began my rounds. This was the part of the evening I had always found most settling. The rounds. There was a particular route I walked most nights, a route that had evolved over the years from a conscious decision into something more like a groove worn into the fabric of the evening. Comfortable, reliable shape to fit. I started at the sheriff's office and moved north along the west side of Maine, checking each building as I passed. The hardware store, the assay office, the barber shop with its striped pole just barely visible in the dark, the milliners that Mrs. Delacroix ran, the land office. Then I turned at the far corner and came back along the east side. The dry goods, the telegraph office, the Amber Post, the small restaurant that a woman named Ida Farrow ran and kept scrupulously clean, the saddlers, and then the livery at the south end. It was a walk of perhaps 15 minutes at my usual pace, which was the pace of a man with nothing pressing him in any particular direction. I checked door latches as I went, not systematically, not with any anxiety, just naturally, the way a man checks things he's responsible for. Most were locked as they should be. The telegraph office had a window latch that I'd been meaning to mention to the operator for the past week. It wasn't exactly broken, but it had a looseness to it that suggested it needed attention before winter, when the wind would find it. I made a note of it in my memory to put in the ledger when I got back. The boardwalk on the east side was older than the west side, had been laid some years earlier, and showed it. The boards had a different sound under my boots, a deeper resonance, slightly more give, and certain boards had their particular voices that I knew as well as I knew anything. There was one board just south of the telegraph office that gave a low creak in a particular key whenever you put weight on it, just past the midpoint. And there was one outside the Amber Post that had a hollow quality, not rotted, but not fully solid, that sounded almost like a muffled drum if you walked across it at any speed. At night, alone, with no other sounds competing, these boards spoke clearly. I passed the Amber Post's side window and saw the glow inside dim slightly, Pete turning down one of the lamps, beginning the closing process. In a few minutes, the windows would go dark, and he'd come out the front and lock up and walk the half block to where he lived in the rooms above the restaurant, and the building would stand dark and quiet until morning. There was something right about that, the way buildings closed up properly for the night, like a complete sentence. I continued to the end of the block, turned into the alley between the saddlers and the livery, and walked along the back of the buildings to check the rear approaches. This was the quietest part of the route. Back here, away from the street, where the darkness was deeper and the sounds were different, a horse shifting in the livery stalls, the soft movement of straw, the occasional restless sound of an animal that wasn't quite settled for the night. I always moved slowly back here and kept my footsteps deliberate, not wanting to startle anything unnecessarily. The horses in particular responded to calm, unhurried movement, and there was no point in winding them up when the evening was trying to wind down. I paused at the back door of the livery and listened. Inside, the soft sounds of horses in their stalls, breathing, the rustle of straw, the occasional gentle stamp of a hoof. Tom Beecham, who ran the livery, was generally done for the evening by this hour, and his small cabin sat at the far corner of the livery yard, where a light still burned in the single window, warm and steady. I could see his silhouette moving past the window once, briefly. Just the ordinary motion of a man moving through his own house. Nothing more. I raised a hand in case he was looking, though I doubted he was, and moved on. Around the back of the saddlers, where a stack of cured leather hides created a particular smell that was rich and dry and somehow deeply comfortable, I stopped and looked up. The stars from back here were the same stars but seemed somehow more numerous, perhaps because the buildings blocked the peripheral view and focused your eyes straight up. And the vertical channel of sky between the roof lines was absolutely dense with light. I stood there for a while. I couldn't tell you how long. A minute perhaps, or two, just looking up. There's a quality to October sky in the desert, friends, that I've thought about many times since. It has a particular depth to it that summer sky doesn't quite have. In summer, the sky is a presence, something you're aware of, sometimes oppressively so when the heat comes down from it. But in October, the sky recedes, pulls back, becomes a distance rather than a presence. And in that distance, all the stars seem to hang farther away, and therefore more themselves, if that means anything. More purely what they are, which is light that has traveled longer than the mind can properly hold, and arrived here in this particular square of sky, behind the saddler's shop in Cottonwood Creek, to be seen by one man who happened to be standing there on a Tuesday evening doing his rounds. I exhaled slowly and continued back out to the street, through the alley at the south end of the block, and then I walked the center of the street for a bit. Not the boardwalk, but the street itself, the packed dirt that held the coolness differently from the boards. That had a slightly different quality of silence under boot leather. Main Street, in the small hours of the night, emptied of everything except the occasional lantern burning at intervals, and the stars above, and the buildings standing on both sides like quiet witnesses. There's a particular feeling to that I can't entirely put into language, except to say it felt like standing inside something rather than outside it. Like the street had a character of its own, separate from the buildings and the people and the commerce. And at night, that character was simply itself, uncomplicated by all the daytime business. I walked the center of the street from the south end to the north end, and then back again, not hurrying. The cold had settled in more thoroughly now, and I could see my own breath, just barely, in the lantern light when I passed close to one. A dog barked once, somewhere on the residential side streets to the west, a single bark that wasn't repeated, and then the quiet came back and sat down again. At the north end of the street, I turned and looked back at the whole length of it. This was something I often did, stood at one end and just looked along it. In the daylight, it was a busy thing, Main Street, with its wagons and horses and people going about their purposes. But at night, emptied and still, it looked like something older, like it had been there longer than the buildings, which of course in a way it had. The path had been there before the buildings, had been a trail before it was a street, and would probably outlast the buildings too, in the long run. The amber post's windows were dark now. Pete had finished his closing and gone home. The only lights left on Main Street were the functional night lanterns. The one outside the sheriff's office, which I always kept burning through the night. The one outside the livery. And the lamp in the telegraph office window that the operator left burning as a matter of company policy. I stood there a bit longer, breathing the cold air, feeling the stillness of the town around me. There was a particular quality to nights like this that I want to try to describe, though I'm not sure I have quite the words for it. A feeling of rightness, I suppose, is the closest I can get. Not happiness exactly, not satisfaction in any complicated sense, just rightness, the feeling of a thing being as it should be. The saloon closed and dark, the horses settled in their stalls, the shopkeepers in their beds, the street empty and clean-looking in the starlight, the cold air doing what cold autumn air is supposed to do, the stars behaving in their ancient and utterly dependable fashion, and one deputy standing at the north end of Main Street, breath just visible in the cold, doing what he was supposed to do, which was to make sure that everything was as it should be, and then let the night alone to do its work. I began to walk back toward the office. My boots on the boardwalk in the silence made a sound that I'd come to think of as one of the particular sounds of my life, a particular weight, a particular rhythm, a particular quality of hollow resonance from those older boards on the east side where I preferred to walk. It's a strange thing to be attached to a sound, but I was attached to that one. Still am, in a way. When I walk that same stretch of boardwalk now, older boards replaced but the same general stretch, I can still hear the memory of those particular sounds underneath the new ones. Like a melody playing under a different tune. I was passing the restaurant when I noticed the light in the amber post window. Not the main windows. Those were dark, as I'd seen. But there was a small high window on the north side of the building that I'd never paid much attention to. A narrow pane near the roof line that I believe looked into some kind of upper storage area. And that window had a thin line of light in it. Not bright, not alarming, not the kind of light that suggested anything was wrong. Just a pale, warm thread of light along the bottom edge of the pane, the kind that gets through under a door or through a gap in floorboards. I stopped and looked at it. Pete's rooms were above the restaurant, not above the amber post. He had no reason to be in the building at this hour. But then, there were a dozen perfectly ordinary explanations. He'd gone back for something, he'd left a lamp burning in the storeroom, and gone back to extinguish it. Any number of things. The quality of the light wasn't urgent. It was the kind of light that suggests someone moving carefully and quietly, not the kind that suggests any disturbance. I crossed to the saloon and tried the front door, which was locked as it should be. I tried the side alley door, also locked. I stood in the alley and looked up at the window, which was perhaps 12 feet above me, too high to see clearly. The thin line of light was still there, steady, not flickering, just present. And then it went out, just like that. Steady one moment, gone the next. The way a lamp goes out when someone cups their hand around the chimney and blows gently, a deliberate extinguishing. I stood in the alley a moment longer, listening. Nothing. No sound of movement from inside, or if there was any, It was below the threshold of what the night was giving me to hear. I checked the alley door once more, still locked, and then I went around to the front and stood looking at the building. The front windows were dark, the whole building was dark, and the night was very quiet. I stayed there a while, not from concern exactly, more from a kind of professional attention, the way you hold a question in your mind, not because it worries you, but because it's there, and your job involves holding questions until they resolve themselves, or until they develop a reason to be more than questions. This one had no particular weight to it. A light in an upper window, gone out. That was all. After a while, I continued my walk. I finished the rest of the route in the usual way, checking the remaining buildings, finding everything latched and dark and orderly. By the time I got back to the sheriff's office, the cold had settled in properly, and my hands were feeling it, and I went inside and added a small amount of wood to the potbelly stove in the corner, and sat down in the chair by the desk with my coat still on, while the warmth built back up. The ledger was open where I'd left it. I wrote a note about the telegraph window latch, and then I sat for a while with a pen in my hand and thought about the light in the amber post window. Thought about it, and then wrote a small entry, barely more than a sentence. North side upper window. Faint light noted approximately 9:45. Extinguished before approach. Front and side doors secured. No further action at this time. That was the kind of entry that sometimes turned into something the following day, and sometimes just remained what it was. A small observation filed away. A detail noted. A question asked and not yet answered. In the morning, I found out the answer, and it was exactly as ordinary as I'd assumed it would be. But I'll get to that. The rest of that evening was the pure, uneventful thing that most evenings were, in the way that I think most evenings should be. Nothing pressing, nothing requiring immediate action. Just the town lying quiet under its blanket of cold and stars, doing what it did between midnight and dawn, which was mostly just exist in its own patient way and wait for the light to come back. I made a cup of coffee from the pot that had been on the stove since late afternoon and was by now the kind of coffee you'd have to work to drink. Thick and bitter and not particularly warm anymore. But it served its purpose. I sat at the desk and went through the week's older entries in the ledger, cross-checking a few things, satisfying myself that everything was in order to present to Sheriff Wallen when he returned Thursday. I was a man who liked things in order, not obsessively so, not in a way that made the work anxious, but in the way that a carpenter likes a joint to fit cleanly. It was simply more satisfying when things aligned as they were supposed to. Around 11 o'clock, I made my final check of the office. Stove banked down to hold through the night without needing attention. Lantern outside the door trimmed and burning steady. Door locked. I went out the back way to where I kept my horse, a brown gelding named Emery, in a small private stall I rented from Tom Beecham. Emery was awake but quiet, standing with his weight shifted to 3 legs and his eyes half closed, in that particular state of alert rest that horses have that isn't quite sleep and isn't quite wakefulness. I gave him a handful of grain from the sack on the shelf and spent a few minutes with him, not really doing anything in particular, just being present. There's a quality to a horse's company at night that's different from the daytime, calmer, less purposeful. In the daytime, a horse is ready to be somewhere, ready to move. At night, a horse is just a large, warm creature in the dark, breathing slowly, occasionally shifting its weight, entirely present in the moment in the uncomplicated way that animals have. I walked home along the side streets, the quiet residential part of town where the houses sat back behind their fences, and the cottonwood trees that lined the creek created a canopy overhead that was just barely visible against the sky. My house was at the end of a short lane, a modest place that I'd made comfortable over the years in the way you make something comfortable when you're in it alone. Things arranged for your own convenience. Shelves built where they were useful. A porch chair set exactly where the morning light would hit it at the right angle. I sat on the porch for a while before going in, the way I often did on clear nights, not thinking about anything in particular, letting the day settle and separate from the night, letting the particular tensions and attentions of the work release themselves gradually into the cold air. The stars were still doing their extraordinary work overhead. The cottonwood trees were still, the leaves quiet. From down toward the creek, the water sound was faintly audible, that soft, continuous murmur that I'd fallen asleep to many hundreds of times and had come to find as natural and necessary as breathing. After a while, I went inside. In the morning, a Wednesday, clear and cold, the kind of morning that makes the air seem sharper and the colors more defined, I walked back down to the amber post before Pete opened. He was there already when I arrived, sweeping out the front room with a long-handled broom, the double doors propped open to let the morning air through. He looked up when my shadow crossed the threshold. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Something I wanted to ask you about." I came inside and stood near the bar, letting the cool morning air follow me in. The saloon smelled differently in the morning, the overlay of evening, tobacco, and whiskey, and the particular warmth of bodies in a closed room had dissipated, and what was left was the smell of old wood and the cedar Pete kept in the storage room to keep the dampness at bay. Small thing, noticed a light in the upper north window last night, late. Around 9:45 or so, Pete stopped sweeping and looked at me with an expression of mild recognition, not surprise. "That'd be my cat," he said. I waited a moment. "Your cat. Brought her in last week to deal with a mouse situation in the storeroom." He resumed sweeping. "Gave her a little lantern in there. A very small one, mind you, so she wouldn't knock anything over in the dark. She tends to move around quite a bit at night. Thought a little light might settle her some. Does it?" Pete considered this. "Not noticeably," he admitted, "but I feel better about it." I stood there for a moment, and then something happened in my chest that I can only describe as a slow, warm release. The feeling of a question resolving itself into an answer so ordinary, so completely in keeping with the quiet logic of the world, that the only appropriate response was a kind of gentle appreciation. Not amusement exactly, more than that, a feeling of having confirmed once again that most things, upon examination, turn out to be exactly as simple as they should be. "I'll make a note," I said. "You do that," Pete said, and went on sweeping. I went out into the morning and continued my rounds. I've thought about that night and that morning many times since, friends, turning it over the way you turn a smooth stone in your hand. not to examine it exactly, just to feel its shape, to confirm that it's the same shape it was the last time you turned it. The town going still, the saloon going quiet, the small orderly process of an evening reaching its natural end, the light in the window, the cat. What I've come to think about that particular memory is that its value isn't in any event it contains, because it doesn't really contain any event worth naming. Its value is in its texture, the feel of those boards under my boots at night, the way the cold air settled in after sundown and changed the quality of everything. The sounds, the light, the way the buildings sat, the stars, the coffee that was too strong and not warm enough, Emery in his stall, half asleep, warm and present, the creek murmuring to itself in the dark. That's what a life is made of mostly. Not the events you'd think to write down if someone asked you for your history. Not the things that came to resolution one way or another. Mostly, it's the texture of ordinary days, the particular sound of a particular board, the way light looks in a window late at night, the patience required to let a question sit until it answers itself, which most questions will, in time, if you give them room. I was a young man then, relatively speaking, young enough that I didn't know yet how clearly I'd remember those evenings. You don't know, when you're walking your rounds and checking your latches and writing your ledger entries, that you're building a memory that will stay with you as clear as glass for 60 years and more. You think you're just doing your job, and you are, but you're also doing something else, something that doesn't have a name on the ledger. You're making the town what it is, by being in it, by knowing it, by caring whether the window latches are solid and whether the horses are settled, and whether a man who drinks quietly in the back corner of a saloon on a Tuesday night has what he needs and nothing troubling him. A town isn't its buildings, is what I'm saying. A town is the people who know it well enough to care whether the boards on the east side need replacing, who know the sound of their own boots on the hollow one outside the amber post, who know which questions need answering tonight and which can wait for morning, and which will answer themselves without any effort on your part at all, if you just leave them alone and let the night finish its work. I knew this town, know it still. Every board and every shadow and every sound it makes in the cold and the heat and the dry seasons and the wet ones. I know where the cottonwood trees drop their leaves first in autumn, and I know where the dust accumulates on the lee side of the buildings when the west wind comes. I know the sound the creek makes in spring when it's running full and confident, and the sound it makes in late summer when it's just barely managing. This town has been my life's work in a way that has nothing to do with the badge or the ledger, though it had a good deal to do with those things too. The work gave me a reason to be in it at all hours, in all weathers, in all seasons. It put me on that boardwalk at 9:45 on an October evening in 1890, looking up at a thin line of light in a high, narrow window, and that is not a small thing. Even if nothing came of it, the cat was comfortable in the storeroom, the horses were settled, the town was asleep, and I walked home under the stars, my boots on the packed dirt of the side street, the cottonwood leaves just barely moving overhead, the creek saying what it always said, and the cold air full of sage and the particular clean smell of autumn in the desert, which is a smell that is made partly of things dying, but mostly of things settling in for the season, conserving what they have, preparing to endure. That is the smell, I think, of patience. And patience is the main thing, the foundation underneath everything else. Patience with the town's rhythms. Patience with questions that don't resolve overnight. Patience with the work, which is mostly small and repetitive and necessary. Patience with the nights that don't offer anything more dramatic than a cat in a storeroom and a lantern burning low. I was patient. I tried to be. I'm still trying, I suppose, in a different way now. Patient with the years. Patient with the memories that come back clearer than the present sometimes. Patient with this old chair and this low fire and the stars doing their reliable work overhead. The fire's getting lower now, friends. It's that time of night when the coals are mostly what's left, that deep red underneath the gray, and the warmth they give is a different kind of warmth than what a flame gives. Quieter, more patient, more willing to just sit here and do what it does, without any fuss. There's a thing I notice on nights like this, when the fire is low and the stars are out and the town is quiet around me. I can hear the creek if I listen. It's still there, after all these years, still running when it has water to run with, still making that particular sound over those particular stones. And I don't imagine I'll ever stop finding that a comfort. Sheriff Wallen came back Thursday. As expected, I showed him the ledger entries. He read the cat entry and looked at me over the top of the ledger with a particular expression that suggested he found it appropriately noted. He was a man who appreciated appropriate notation. The telegraph office window latch got seen to the following week. The Amber Post stood on Main Street for another 30 years after that night, before it came down eventually in a fire that started in the kitchen of the restaurant next door one hot summer and moved fast. By then, Pete Alderman had sold the place and retired, and the new owner was a man I knew less well. The building that went up in its place was wider and less characterful, as new buildings often are, but it served its purpose, and the town went on. The Grula mare, as it turned out, belonged to a woman from out past the Eastern Flats who'd come in to arrange some business at the land office. I never saw her again, or if I did, I didn't make the connection. But I thought about her horse for a while after, that gray-blue coat and the neat way it had stood at the rail in the afternoon light. And I thought she must have been a good rider to keep a horse that tidy-looking after a long ride in from the flats. Small things. That's what I'm left with after all these years. Not the large events, which happen too, but which have a way of flattening themselves in memory, becoming stories you've told so many times, they stop feeling like memories and start feeling like reports. The small things stay vivid because you never told them to anyone, never shaped them into anything beyond what they were. And so they remain raw, unshaped, exactly as they felt at the time. The cold air on the back of my hands, the hollow sound of that particular board, the thin line of light in the high window, Emery, warm and half asleep, eating grain from my hand, the creek. These things have stayed with me as clearly as anything I've known, and on nights like tonight when the fire is low and the air is cool and the stars are out, I find them easy to reach, close to the surface, as available as the sound of the creek itself, which I can still hear if the night is quiet enough. It's quiet enough tonight. Friends, I'm grateful you're sharing this old memory with me here. There have been other evenings in Cottonwood Creek, and perhaps one day I'll be able to tell you about them if you're willing to sit and listen to an old man's memories. Many quiet evenings have passed in town, and I've been to countless, each with its own unique texture, its own quality of coolness or warmth, its own sounds and shadows. But for now, the fire has done its work, and the night has done most of its work, and I think we all need to rest. Find a comfortable spot. Let the stars do their work. The creek will still be flowing in the morning. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, comment, and like for more stories. Sleep well. Good night.